ThreatTraq for March 11th, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by John Hogaboom and Matt Keyser. I'm Brian Rexroad, and Matt, I think, we keep finding vulnerabilities with this, that, and the other thing. Even though we think it's secure, sometimes it's not as secure as we'd like. Tell us a little about it.
So researchers at UC Berkeley just released a study about the HTTPS protocol, which most of our viewers will know is an encrypted protocol that protects web traffic. They did a bit of traffic analysis, and they found that they could take a look at encrypted HTTPS traffic and determine what sorts of content people were looking at. Now, the way they did this was to spider the entire sites that they were interested in. There were a number of those, like Planned Parenthood, Kaiser Permanente, Bank of America, a small handful of popular sites. They sort of spidered the entire website as much as they could for the ones they were trying to do this sort of correlation on. Then they broke those scans down into sort of manageable chunks of different feature sets, and then using traffic captures from encrypted versions of just browsing the site, arbitrary users, they were able to, with 89% accuracy, determine roughly where on the site the user was actually browsing. Now, there's a privacy problem here because, example, you're at the Mayo Clinic site and you're looking up a very specific medical, problem you've got personally or someone you know has got. Typically, that's a very private thing. You wouldn't want someone else to know, but if someone else can make that assumption and say, well, based on my knowledge of the site and the traffic that I'm seeing, I can say reasonably that you have an interest in this medical problem. Same thing for banking. If you're going to a site and maybe you want to, you've got some sort of sensitive financial transaction that you don't want someone to know about, or maybe you've got political views and they've got a website that has these views and is also encrypted, it would also be possible to do the same kind of correlation analysis. Now, to be fair, it's not necessarily a simple task to do this sort of analysis. I mean, you do have to spider the entirety of the site, and you have to know some fairly above-average math to be able to do the correlation machine learning portion of it. If you're maybe Joe Schmo hacker at a cafe, on the Wi-Fi, that thing's it's not going to work out for you. But if you're maybe an ISP, you have access to huge amounts of traffic and the ability to do an intelligent spidering of a site, then this is where the attack starts to become feasible.
That's actually a very interesting study, and it's actually not a particularly new one. I think, well, first of all, one of the things that you want to be concerned about here is the fact that from a privacy standpoint, I think you were pointing out you have to know what the site was, but that could be done after the fact. That is, if you're trying to understand what somebody was doing, if you're able to have visibility, you use the example that your Wi-Fi hotspot or something like that, you could go to the site and spider it afterward to see, okay, it looks like that person perhaps visited these pages. So it seems like you'd have to put an awful lot of work in for what I would describe as somewhat questionable information in terms of usefulness or practicality or something along those lines. I guess, there perhaps would be some cases where perhaps in a law enforcement action or something like that might be useful. I'm not sure. There are techniques to get around these sorts of things as well. They typically aren't implemented as a part of HTTPS. Perhaps that's sort of an undertone of the proposal here, is that there are ways that you can pad packets or change the size. I presume that most of what they're measuring here are, like the size of the download associated with particular pages and perhaps some other characteristics around that. So there will be ways to get around that by padding certain communications so that it at least confuse the situation, if not subvert it altogether.
Mm-hmm. And the original paper does mention a couple of ways to mitigate the damage from this attack. So it's worth a read if you can get your head around the math, and I'm still not sure that I have. So.
Well, it's certainly an interesting topic and one that perhaps becomes of more interest as more protection measures are put into place and considerations around that. And we were talking about this just before. There are other things like this that have been studied in the past, things like CPU utilization on computers. If you can get some insight into that, you can get some insight into what kinds of things are taking place. In fact, that's a method that's been used in trying to identify key information on exchanges as well. So something that there is a whole sort of field of study in terms of resource utilization and what that reveals about communications activities that are taking place.
Right. This feels more like a side channel attack than a direct attack on HTTPS. Nothing is really being decrypted here.
Right. Absolutely.
I was going to say, Brian, I think you had mentioned, maybe yesterday or a few days ago when we first caught wind of this article that this type of kind of statistical pattern analysis is not a domain strictly in computer science or communication necessarily, but I think people had observed during, just prior to Desert Storm, the number of pizza deliveries were really high to the Pentagon, prior to that activity. So that was perhaps an indicator someone was actually paying attention that something was being spun up in terms of that.
Right, absolutely. This is this whole notion of transmission security. ThreatTraq is actually a sort of a subcategory of what we typically call operation security, which is, being able to observe activities that are only indirectly related to the real activities that are taking place. That fact that a bunch of pizza orders came in at the Pentagon was a pretty strong indicator of the start of Desert Storm after the Desert Shield activities years ago. And, it's that type of thing that you want to pay attention to if you're really concerned about the peripherals around the security environment. Good story. That's a really interesting one. Certainly, at the very least, from an intellectual point of view, or considering all the little wraparounds associated with security, you can really dig into that one. Mm-hmm. So let's go to John here and talk a little bit about some of the latest threats. The quarterly report has just come out from McAfee, and that's always got some interesting things. What can you tell us, John?
Yeah, sure. So McAfee released their fourth quarter report, and often I like to look at the fourth quarter more than the other quarters in between because it kind of gives you a summary of, okay, here, what was the kind of trend that we saw from the beginning of the year till the end of the year. There's a couple of interesting observations that they had in their report. One of the things big in the last fourth quarter of 2013 that we're probably all aware of is kind of the rise in awareness and maybe some really large incidents regarding point-of-sale attacks, Target being one of them. That was one of the big media stories. And subsequently after that, Michael Stores, they also have on their timeline Easton Bell Sports, which I'm not familiar with that one. But even prior to that, there were some other mercantile-type outfits that were targeted as well, like Neiman Marcus. I know that we've heard about that one, and some other smaller ones that aren't necessarily as well-known. But the point-of-sale attack, I guess the big thing in my mind is it's one of those things where I kind of consider it a little bit in between the type of malware people get on their home PCs and between the APT type of attackers, which are still on, desktop workstations and whatnot, although they can kind of span across a lot of things. But in terms of the threat vector, or how much of a threat they pose, instead of, on your home PC, the malware authors have to kind of harvest credentials one by one. So they have to infect, many different users in order to get credentials and harvest them one by one from each person. Whereas with these point-of-sale attacks, they can go kind of right to the source and, harvest all the credentials that they've acquired, mostly credit card numbers and whatnot, from, a large volume of users that might have used that particular company. So certainly the threat vector is a lot larger there. And it's not unusual, I don't mean to completely side tangent, but we've seen, so when you talk about an individual getting targeted and then a company getting targeted where all the data is kind of collected together, we've seen in APT incidents similar types of strategies where instead of targeting necessarily a company that they're interested in, they might target a law firm that represents that company in such a way that now if they can get into that law firm, they can get all of the information about that company that is nicely organized for them in a very nice and neat bundle because someone at that law firm has already done that kind of thing. So a little bit of a tangent, but I guess I'm just kind of talking about how the information is collected and organized together and how much easier it is to get what you need relative to that.
Right. So, it's this notion of data repositories. One of the, as we talk about big data, security needs to be an integral part of that discussion because it's a place where data gets aggregated and I don't want to say ripe for the picking, but it's one that you want to be paying a lot of attention to from a security standpoint, and these are clearly examples of exactly that kind of scenario.
Right. So number 2 on their list was an interesting one. Malicious signed binaries has increased by about a factor of 3 times from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And you can kind of see the dramatic rise here and they're actually going back to 2011, from 2011 all the way up to the fourth quarter of last year. Compared to the first quarter, it was probably around 750,000 malicious signed binaries that they had in that first quarter of 2013. And in the end, and this is new samples, by the way, for each quarter, it was probably, I'm just kind of eyeballing it here, it's probably 2.2 million. So that's probably it's close to double, maybe not exactly, but still quite a lot. And one of the interesting asides from this is, so if you're not familiar with code signing, it's basically you can take your software, and just like you can sign your communications with SSL, kind of similar kind of technique where you can sign code. So you have someone who's a trusted authority who gives you a signing certificate like VeriSign or other vendors out there, and allows you to sign your code so that when someone goes to install it, it'll look like it's actually a reputable type of piece of software. It's actually been signed by some trusted authority. The interesting thing about this is they noticed that, we've talked in the past about stolen certificates, code signing certificates, and ones that are purchased fraudulently or they've somehow abused them or whatnot, the services to get certificates. But what they saw in this last period or pretty much over the course of the year is the vast majority of the growth is due to these dubious content distribution networks. So there's these CDNs out there, not the big names that we're familiar with, but they're basically these kind of code signing vendors that'll let you sign your code using their installer. And they kind of have a business model where they're these pay-per-install type of services. So they actually get revenue by getting their software installed. So they allow you to use their installer as part of, and wrap your code inside their installer to get it installed. So when you look at the executable, it looks like it's, code signed by such and such installation service company, and they actually have a legitimate certificate, but it's a little bit questionable as to how reputable they are based on what we've been seeing in how they're allowing just about anybody to use their software to sign their code.
Yeah, this sounds like one of those, yet another sort of example. We've seen a lot of cases where even the dividing line, the line between non-malicious and malicious software gets a little bit fuzzy, and this sounds like it's perhaps a similar kind of situation where, they have sort of a sense of legitimacy, and then some things slip through, and it might not be that they're looking really closely, and it's sort of allowing it to slip through. In fact, we've seen some things sort of on the other side in the past where we've seen file sharing networks, BitTorrent networks that were built under the auspices of a legitimate file sharing network, but was actually built up of members in a botnet that had been basically, illegitimately recruited into this file sharing network. And this looks a little bit like the same sort of kind of problem where, hitting that gray space and seeing how far they could stretch it.
Right, exactly. The third one that they had on their list is kind of a little self-serving, in my opinion, but they had done some research into a Microsoft Office zero-day exploit that affected Microsoft Word, the docx format. It was an APT type of targeted attack for that zero-day being used, discovered by McAfee Labs, and they did some research and they did a lot of analysis around this. But my point about this is that all 0 days are worrisome. And, often we see these leveraged initially by these types of nation-state APT-type actors because they're usually the ones discovering them, and they know that they're not known by anybody yet, so they'll use them. But the thing about that is pretty quickly thereafter, sometimes only a couple of weeks you'll start to see those exploits. Once they're actually known and they're seen in the wild, other people figure out what they're doing, and they can leverage those. And now with the abundance of exploit kits that are out there, everybody's been rolling them into their own exploit kits, these various new vectors for exploitation, usually drive-by type things, and it just becomes very mainstream. So patching is really critical, and doing so quickly, because even though you might not be part of a target space for an APT type of attack where they're leveraging this, pretty soon thereafter it's going to get into the mainstream, and you're going to see all these mainstream malware type of malware malicious programs out there starting to use it as well as a vector to infect your machine. So it's really important to get your machines patched as quick as possible.
Yes, the mere knowledge that an exploit is possible will draw attention to that vulnerability, and folks will start developing that sort of capability. So that's where these 0 days are certainly attractive. But if they're able to get a sample of the malware and reverse engineer it, it's even that much easier.
And then the last one that they talked about here, and I actually linked as well their mobile security trend report. McAfee has a special report that they just put out last month, actually, on specifically mobile malware. This kind of includes it as well. The big story here is that mobile malware, no surprise to us, has been increasing dramatically. A lot of this is because of Android devices that are an open platform, but there are a lot of other vendors out there that have malware on their mobile devices. They do mention that the Android malware almost tripled from 2012 to 2013. That's a little bit of a troubling thing for me. I don't like to see that. We talk about the types of malware we've been seeing on Android for the past couple of years now, and it just seems, probably 2 years ago, we would report a story on it maybe once a month, but now it seems like it's probably twice a month, maybe even every episode, where we might cover a new Android piece of malware. I think Matt actually has one to talk about later on in the show here. So not a surprise that it's growing. The amount of malware in general is, in my opinion, has grown so greatly in the number of samples per even day that come in. It's almost a losing battle for any antivirus vendor. I don't know how they do it, because there's just so much diversity in the malware population out there, and the amount of polymorphic nature in a lot of them now, that it's almost trying to do anything signature-based is almost a losing battle, I think. In any event, it's not good. We used to be able to rely on AV back in the day to knock down most of the malware, but now it's so fast and so rapid and so rapidly changing, and so much of it that it's almost impossible to keep up.
Yeah, it's probably worthwhile to point out that there still are lots of different versions of malware that are being generated, but at the same time, a lot of the counts are really associated with the polymorphism, as you're referring to, that is characteristics that appear to be different malware from a signature standpoint, but may have lots of similar characteristics to another one. There may be only subtle changes, or maybe just repacked in a different package, so it looks from a signature standpoint like different malware, but ultimately is the same as something that perhaps is already known. And your point is well taken. That is, there certainly has been a large growth in the malware associated with mobility. As you said, we've been predicting this for a long time. It is growing rapidly, and I think that's basically a direct consequence of more and more activity going to mobile devices. And again, to reiterate, as you pointed out, it's the side loading. It's the non-reputable application sources that you really need to be paying the most attention to. That is, generally speaking, in the reputable marketplaces, the malware sneaks in there from time to time, but it gets taken off relatively quickly, so the impact of those is quite a bit less.
And handsets themselves have gotten so powerful that they're a much more attractive, resource for an attacker, to compromise, because in the old days, a phone really didn't have a lot of computing power, but nowadays they have quite a bit of computing power. So it's an attractive space to try to get some devices for your botnet.
All right, very good. So speaking of mobile malware, Matt, I think you had. I think to John's point earlier, we're seeing lots and lots of new varieties of mobile malware. I think what we try to do is pick out ones that have some significant characteristics, and I think you have a few to share with us here.
Yep, I have one in particular. Lookout recently wrote an article about one that they found in the underground called Dendroid. Now, Dendroid is a rat kit, a remote access tool kit for Android. And what it allows the owner to do is to create their very own malware and remote access toolkit for any Android phone. One of the more interesting and unique features of it is that it has the ability to evade detection by Google Bouncer, which is the tool that Google uses to vet applications automatically when they're submitted to the Play Store. Now, the Google Bouncer has features for emulation, which sort of runs the code in its own little box on the side and sees what it does. And Dendroid applications will actually detect this emulation bit and hide themselves to evade detection. So far, Dendroid has made it into the Play Store at least once that we know about, and that was located and the app was taken down. Another interesting feature is that it comes with software that allows you to what they call universally bind the application to any other Android application that you have an APK file for, which is the equivalent of an exe file from Windows, an executable. So what you can do is, if you have any legitimate Android application, you can use the universal binder portion of this tool and cram Dendroid into it as well, and when you run the one combined bit of code, both of them will run. So it'll appear to the user as if they're using a legitimate application, and Dendroid will kick off. And Dendroid has most of the things you'd expect to see from a RAT, the ability to download pictures from the device, spy on web browsing history, but also since it's for Android, for phone devices, it can record calls, intercept SMS, and use the camera to take photos of the user. So all in all, it's a pretty, it's a package deal. It's not something that, rats aren't anything new that we've seen in typically the PC space. It's a newer thing to see it for Android. And it's the thing that's more troubling about it is that it costs $300, and any fool who can get a hold of a couple of Bitcoins can go purchase this in the underground. And we were just talking about the explosion of Android malware. I think kits like this are going to only, make that problem worse.
So there are a couple of trends here that we need to probably be paying attention to. I think most of our audience is probably associated with enterprise activities, so I'll use that or sort of emphasize that point. One here is that if a device is BYOD, one of the things you want to be paying attention to is that more of the subscriber programs associated with devices are basically taking away subsidies associated with devices, or at least providing that option. That is, you can go buy your own device as an everyday consumer, and then bring it to your service provider and then use it with your service provider. The consequence of that is that if you buy it from a shady market, perhaps it's a used device, for example, you're buying a one that's been a hand-me-down or something like that because they're quite a bit less expensive, you need to be paying attention to what's already loaded on that device, because it may not be reputable stuff on there, and it could have something like this just kind of bundled in. And so that's, I guess, and I want to give credit to Jeff Bickford, one of the researchers on our team that's sort of brought this point to my attention today, that that is one mechanism outside of the off the main market app loading that you could end up with Trojan applications on your device. Second aspect that I wanted to share with you is this notion of BYOD and the enterprise. That is, devices may be allowed access to an enterprise network through a VPN. So as rat tools like this are brought into the mix, it may be accessing right through your enterprise firewall, but if you don't have the detections for the mobile devices on in your environment, you're sort of setting yourself up for perhaps having remote access through a mobile device, which without antivirus installed and the right control policies in place, you may have a little difficulty investigating that, doing the forensics, identifying what the real problem is, or even detecting it in the first place. So these are kinds of things that we need to be paying attention to as we go into the brave new world of unsubsidized devices and BYOD and enterprises.
It's interesting you mentioned applications that come in before they even become part of your BYOD program, because that reminds me of an article I was reading about. I think it was a fake Netflix application that was bundled on a number of devices that came straight from stores. I mean, at some point during the supply chain, these phones, and I forget which providers they were actually with, someone had loaded on a fake Netflix application, which was actually a Trojan. So, I mean, it's enough to worry about, picking up a phone from someplace that's a little bit shady, but even when you have, legitimate stores to contend with, you have to trust everything that they hand to you when you buy your brand new, quote-unquote, phone. It gets a little bit tricky.
Well, I'll say it again, for the most part, and this is actually, I think, a pretty good testimony to both the OS manufacturers and the device providers. For the most part, so far, we have not seen any significant amount of actually exploiting the device itself. It's been this, side-loading type activities and, Trojan applications that appear to be something legitimate and are actually not. And so, in that sense, you have the opportunity to use reputable sources in terms of your devices and in your applications on those devices to do a pretty good job at protecting yourself. And then, of course, adding some security protections on the device itself will be helpful too. Mm-hmm. All right, so I guess in terms of adding security protections to devices, John, I think you have another story that'll probably lead us right into the Internet Weather Report for the day.
Yeah, actually, it seems like things are kind of merging together here. So it's a good segue because we're just talking about devices that probably don't have a lot of good onboard security or antivirus like mobile phones, and there are some AV vendors for those. If anybody, in terms of the types of small devices, has AV, it would be the mobile phone space. But this whole Internet of Things, which is quickly becoming maybe the buzzword of 2014, it seems like. A few people have been talking about the Internet of Things and how an antivirus solution is really needed in this space. And we've talked about this a lot. So when we're talking about the Internet of Things, we're talking about your home routers, maybe some network-attached storage devices, maybe your DVR or your television or your phone, your VoIP phone at home or even at work. Printers, another example of an embedded device that are all network connected, but you don't really necessarily have a good user interface to understand that something might be going on those and it needs to either get patched or that there's some kind of malware, it's been compromised. There's a couple of researchers who have been looking into this actual problem. The first one is a company that kind of spun out of Columbia University called Red Balloon. They've been doing a lot of research in this space, looking at how these embedded type devices get hacked, mostly IP phones. They work a lot in the IP phone space. And they've come out with a product that they're working on called Symbiote, which is an interesting technique. It didn't really get into a lot of discussion in the article about how this works, but it sounds to me like what they're doing is injecting a small piece of code in the underlying hardware of the machine, almost like a rootkit, that's looking at the upper layer operating system that's running. And it's looking for changes in the software. So, a lot of these embedded devices have some kind of firmware, and it's somewhat static in terms of what's actually on the device. It doesn't change as much as like your Windows machine or even your phone would. And so what they're kind of doing, from what I understand of the article, is they're kind of looking for changes in the code. So they're monitoring at a very low level to see if there's any change in the code on that embedded device as an indicator that something might be going awry on it. And they also claim that it is a operating system independent type of approach, which I find interesting. I'm not quite sure how that works. It can't be a completely architecture independent type of thing, but I guess maybe you have a MIPS version and you have something or whatever that runs at the lower level of the hardware. In any event, that's one technique. So then there's another organization out there also looking into this, and the other one is MITRE, who is a nonprofit, federally funded research and development center that a lot of people are probably familiar with. So MITRE has been looking into this as well. They're looking at a slightly different approach, and instead of looking for code modifications, they're looking they're looking for attempts to conceal presence on the machine or on the device. And the changes, it's more of a behavioral type of, from what it reads like, it's more of a behavioral type of thing where they're looking for types of patterns of behavior, things are taking longer to happen, basically some type of detectable change in the amount of time it takes for certain activities to occur on the device as opposed to what it used to take. The good news story about this is we've known this is a problem. We've been talking about it probably 2 years, but more aggressively probably for the past 3 or 4 months because there's been such a problem with lots of embedded devices, especially in the consumer device space, the small home routers and whatnot, or other types of little network-attached storage things that you might have in your home. And so some people are actually looking into this. It looks like a lot of this is being funded mostly by government-type sector because they're looking at types of devices that they have, I'm sure, and they're worried about the same kind of problem that everybody is, but maybe it's a little bit more important in those spaces to make sure those devices are secure.
Inevitably, it's going to be important for everybody, and I think it's, if this is a government-funded activity, I think it's probably a good investment to get some activity around this. Like you said, we've been talking about this. We're going to talk a little bit more about it as we talk about the Internet weather. This notion of devices that aren't patched and don't have virus protection are on all the time and exposed to the Internet just doesn't work from a security standpoint. What you described here actually was very reminiscent of a tool that was generated a long time ago to help protect Unix systems, Tripwire, which still is available as a commercial product. It was originated as a university research project, I think back around in 1997 or so. Gene Spafford comes to mind as one of the folks that was involved in that. So, which was doing exactly as you described, looking for changes in files on the system. And I think that philosophy is really a good approach in cases like this, at least for the time being, where you have a fairly stable system and it's not changing very often. I think one of the problems with Tripwire that's come over time is that there are so many changes in systems and your typical, general purpose system that it's very difficult to determine which things should be allowed to change and which things not, although I think they have some tools to help you with that these days.
Right.
It's an intriguing topic, and it's good to see that there's some work going on in that direction. So let's take a look at the Internet weather for the last week or so here, and I think, John, you talked about this scan sources and then actually scan probes that are taking place as well. I think I had even reported on it a couple of weeks ago. This is still, I think, at the top of the list in terms of the number of anomalies that it's generating on the network, and also in terms of the amount of activity that it's generating in terms of probing activity on the network right now. This scan source is on port 5000 TCP, and we have it associated with this Synology disk station manager, and I'll go ahead and let you talk about it in a second here, John, but most of the probes that we see are actually in China, U.S., and there are many other countries associated with that. This is going to be something you're going to want to pay attention to, that is make sure that you're obviously protecting on port 5000 from the Internet. Perhaps even in an enterprise you want to take a look at and see if anything's leaked into your enterprise as well. But this appears to be, devices that have been infected and then are going off and trying to infect other devices here. Now, the pattern of activity here, you see the sort of sawtooth-like pattern. This is fairly indicative of a botnet-type activity. In fact, it looks like it's on somewhat of a manual control here. So this doesn't appear to be an automatically propagating worm. What it appears to be is that devices are being commanded to go out and scan on this port. And as they complete their tasks, some finish earlier than others, you see this decay effect that takes place, and then eventually the botnet operator comes back and says, okay, repeat that activity, and they continue further, and you can see that there's an incremental increase in the number of resources they have available. And then sometimes what they may do is split the botnet off once it gets so large, so you may see less resources going forward, or maybe some protection activity took place that actually reduced the size of the botnet. But ultimately, this is a pattern that you typically see in these sorts of activities. And John, I'll go ahead and let you elaborate a little bit about what you found about this TCP scanning activity and how you at least believe that it's associated with this Synology disk station
Okay, yeah, sure, Brian. So I talked about this last week on the show as well, because 5000 TCP had exploded and took over the top spot on our top scan probes pie chart that we normally do. And I was kind of like, well, what the heck is this? You know, we know that 5000 TCP is associated with universal plug-and-play, but I think even last week I said, I'm not quite sure. My gut kind of told me, I don't think this is universal plug-and-play they're looking for here, but I wasn't positive. So one of the things, we're scratching our head, Jim and I, after the show, and we're thinking, well, we should just check our honeypots that we have and see if we could capture some of this traffic and get an idea of what they're looking for. So we did that last week after the show, and of all the probes that we got, I probably got about, in a very short time span, probably less than an hour, I think I got 30 probes that came in. All of them were looking for this particular URL pattern here that's listed on the screen here. So it's trying to get this /webman/info.cgi (host equals). When you look that up, it's actually associated with this Synology Disk Station Manager. There was a vulnerability, came out sometime late last year, I want to say September maybe of last year, regarding this particular product. This is apparently a software product that's on top of some hardware that Synology, for their Disk Station and Rack Station products. I'm not really familiar with it. The long and short is it's matching the exact signature pattern. We know that if they're looking for this, there's a particular, I think they're testing for the presence of this URL to identify that it is in fact the Synology Disk Station Manager, and that they can go then exploit it further. I didn't try to trick it into trying to engage me any further than that. But, we do link some of the write-ups on how this is exploited and what the CVEs associated with that and whatnot.
All right, cool. Thank you, John. All right, next item here is scan probes on port 7778 TCP. This is generally associated with Oracle HTTP server. I did not find anything very specific that might have motivated this activity, but as you can see from the graph here, we actually started seeing what I would describe as some somewhat spiky probing activity just around the beginning of March here. There are various sources that they tend to come and go over time. The most volume that I happened to run into was coming from France, but there were also sources in Hungary, Great Britain. There seem to be other countries involved in this as well. So it seems to be moving around quite a bit. Does not appear to be a significant number of sources participating in it overall, however. As you can see from the beginning of March, there's been some somewhat continuous scanning activity, still very spiky in nature, and certainly less significant in terms of volume. Now, there's a possibility this might be going after something like IRC that's running on an alternate port. We didn't dig into that much further, but there's a reasonable chance that it's going after an Oracle application. Next item here is one that I think we reported on before as well. This is scan sources on port 32764 TCP. The sources here tend to be fairly broad spread across the number of countries: China, Korea, U.S., Hong Kong. As I'd reported at least a couple of weeks ago, there was some information that we were able to find that suggested this might be associated with an exploit against some Linksys devices. Again, devices that are on the Internet exposed, perhaps intentionally exposed to the Internet, but potentially vulnerable to attacks of this sort. So since we saw this activity start around the third week in February, we've continued to see at least some activity, and it's been up and down since then, and some of the most recent activity has been the largest. And by the way, what I'm showing here is scan sources, the number of sources. That there's a very strong correlation to the number of probes that we've seen to the number of sources, and it's up around, about 1,000, 1,500 sources at peak here that we've seen in this activity. Significantly less than we've seen in terms of the number of sources on port 5,000, but certainly up there as well. Some of the diversity in this activity, I think, John, you'd reported last week that you didn't see a strong correlation between the number of the specific source IPs that were scanning on port 23 versus port 5,000. There wasn't a strong correlation there. There are probably multiple groups doing this scanning activity, or perhaps the botnet's been split into different pieces. Some additional investigation is probably warranted to see if there is a relationship between these. But it is, reasonable to expect that this Internet of devices that are being exploited here have some different groups that are targeting them and using some different techniques and perhaps some different motivations in terms of using them. Which, incidentally, there was a recent analysis or some findings that we ran into that perhaps we can do a little more in-depth report on this next week, John, but that suggested that some of these devices might be used to host phishing sites, and so that's another aspect of this. It perhaps points to some of the motivation for finding these devices. Again, lots of attractive attributes. They're exposed to the Internet all the time. They're turned on all the time. No antivirus, not much monitoring or intrusion detection in place to be able to detect those nefarious activities until somebody reports it.
Right. We've definitely seen isolated cases of these devices being used to host phishing pages. I don't know if that's a widespread activity or what yet, but we can try to dig into that more for next week.
And to put this into perspective here, here's the pie chart for yesterday's activity, March 10th, the most probe ports, and you see here that a good third of it is covered by port 5000 TCP activity and then followed by port 23 activity. We're going to take a little bit of a closer look at port 23 here in a moment, but then followed by port 22 TCP, port 445, which is that latent configure activity, port 80 TCP, which we normally see here, port 3389 TCP that we normally see, that's remote desktop protocol, 1433 TCP going after Microsoft SQL database, and then 443 TCP, which probably is a sister to this port 80 activity. I think, John, like I said, recalling you had done a little bit of a comparison between port 5000 and port 23 activity. The port 23 scanning activity still is strong relative to what we'd even typically seen in the past. And we always see scanning activity. I think we've been reporting over and over and over again port 23 scanning activity, but clearly this is way up above from what we had typically seen in the past. And a little bit later, we're going to take a look at the daily reconnaissance index, and I think that puts some things into perspective as well. Next item here is the most sources doing that probing, and we see most of them on port 445 TCP, and then followed by port 23 TCP. So we just took a look at that activity, and then followed by port 5000. And then we also see, as we typically do, the what I'll call the residual peer-to-peer activity associated with the zero-access botnet. So we're going to take a quick look at the zero-access botnet here. This is a good news trend that we're seeing. We're actually looking at the last 365 days of activity here, and these are 4 ports that are associated with the peer-to-peer activity associated with different versions of the zero-access botnet. This is port 16465, port 16471, port 16464, and port 16470, all UDP, where the zero-access botnet had a peer-to-peer network to be able to exchange information between the bots. As we've, I think, reported a number of times before, there was actually a takedown activity way back in July last year, which had some not long-lasting effect on the botnet. We saw it pick up and significantly peaked up around, I would say, the middle of October here in terms of its strength. And then there was a second takedown activity of Microsoft being involved in that activity, in which case it did have some significant impact on the command and control associated with the botnet. If I recall correctly, the botnet operators basically raised the white flag and decided to abandon that botnet. And then since then, we've seen first a quick downturn in the number of infected devices, probably associated with the malicious software removal tool for Microsoft. And then since then, a slower but steady downturn or downward trend in the number of participants in that activity. So continues to reduce. That's a good sign, and we hope it continues to do that. And last but not least here, I wanted to share with you the Daily Reconnaissance Index. Again, we're looking at 1 year of activity here, and this is just to basically put into perspective some of the scanning activity. There's also some activity that's associated with some of these reflection attacks, most notably around the September to, I'm going to say around December timeframe here. Those are probably most notably associated with, or most significantly influenced by the some of these reflection attacks. Some of the more recent activity, I think, is associated with this, what I would describe as a significant upsurge in activity scanning for devices that would be exploitable that are perhaps not protected in other ways. And we see a peak here up around 60. Now, this reference point dates back a number of years to the Sasser botnet, where we basically, or the Sasser worm, I should say, it wasn't much of a botnet per se, but it was set at a metric of about, I think, 100 right around that time. So that was kind of where the internet was a mess with worms. Unfortunately, well, we had stabilized around in the 20s or so, and actually prior to that in the teens. And here we are back up around peaking out at about 60. So not a particularly good sign in terms of reconnaissance overall, but we at least have a better understanding of what's going on and are working on solutions there. So that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ThreatTraq@lists.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel at att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube, and you can get an audio-only version on iTunes. We'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, John and Matt. I thought we had some really good discussion here today. We'll be back next week with another episode, and until then, please keep your network safe.